Here we are. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Keller. I'm the curriculum developer of online platforms and programs for the YMCA's Youth Cannabis Awareness Program. And over the next 75 minutes to 90 minutes, we will be presenting one of our newer modules titled Cannabis and the Developing Brain. Now, joining us this afternoon, we do have our British Columbia-based EAC, Meg. Do you want to take a moment and introduce yourself there, Meg?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so my name is Meg Signorelli. I am the Education Awareness Coordinator for the province in BC. I'd like to first acknowledge that I am residing in Vancouver, which is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Excited to be here with you, Steve.
Thank you so much. And I am presenting from sunny Peterborough, Ontario, upon territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe and adjacent to the Haudenosaunee territory. I've grown up in this region and have been able to spend a great deal of time as a child on the lands in the Mohawk region, as my grandmother was a member of the community. And as an adult, I've been able to spend the last several years working and learning a great deal from the NADAP programs, the Indigenous service providers, and the family health teams in Curve Lake, as well as Alderville and Hiawatha. So I do strongly encourage those of you who are listening today, not only when acknowledging the lands to really think about and understand the tradition and the history in our region, but also to connect with the communities themselves to see what we can learn and how we can work together to really further our understandings and make sure that our services are accessible for everyone. Now, before we get into the heart of our presentation, we always like to start off every workshop that we do by explaining a little bit about who we are. So the first thing about our program, the Youth Cannabis Awareness Program, is that we are neutral on the topic of cannabis. Meg, how would you explain this to our audience?
Yeah, for sure. So basically what that means is that we are not here to promote cannabis use, but we also don't judge or stigmatize those who do choose to use cannabis either recreationally or medically. So rather, we want to provide youth and adults with the most accurate and unbiased information about cannabis so we can work to create a safe space for people to ask their questions, comments, thoughts, and beliefs about cannabis with a focus on healthy development. So we do try to take a neutral and objective stance.
Excellent, thank you. From there, the second point of our program is that we promote what we call a balanced perspective. Part of our mandate is that we do have to explain the potential risks of cannabis use and the signs of problematic or risky behavior. However, if we were to only talk about sort of the risks or the cons, shall we say, our program would struggle to maintain a sense of balance. So we do also understand and acknowledge and can certainly discuss the uses for cannabis, whether the industrial uses, the potential medical uses, all of which we do recommend you consult with a healthcare provider if you're thinking of using cannabis for any medicinal purpose. But our job is to maintain that sense of balance. I always say we're not here to try to sway the audience's opinion. We simply want to inform it so that you have as much knowledge about the cannabis sort of spectrum, the cannabis landscape, shall we say, as possible before making decisions and jumping to conclusions. Now, the last pillar of our program is that we do promote harm reduction. Meg, how would you explain that one to our audience?
Yeah, so harm reduction is really all about reducing the harms associated with cannabis. So it's pretty straightforward. Basically, it's all about making behavioral changes that will minimize the reduce of experiencing any harmful outcomes. And we actually engage in harm reductions daily in our lives. You just might not know it. So for example, when we use our seatbelts in the car, when we wear a helmet if we're riding our bike or skateboard, or even just when we're looking both ways to cross the street. Those are all examples of harm reduction because we're preventing something dangerous or harmful from happening to us. Now, when we apply harm reduction in the context of cannabis, this could look like delaying your cannabis use until you turn the age of 25, or designating a driver if you do plan on using cannabis. There's many different ways that we can engage in harm reduction through cannabis, and we'll be talking about these later on in the presentation as well.
Wonderful. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Now, we do have an agenda of what exactly it is that we're going to be covering today. The first thing that we're going to talk about, and we do this in every presentation, is really speak about just sort of what cannabis is. Now, the focal point of this presentation is on the adolescent brain development, so we may not go as in-depth into our understanding and awareness of cannabis as we do in many of our other workshops. And if you would like to learn more about the cannabis plant and methods of consumption, you can certainly contact us at YCAP, that is YCAP, at ymcagta.org. to book a workshop or to learn more about any of the services that we offer. And we will also put our website into the chat panel in a moment as well. But that being said, after we discuss what cannabis is, we need to really establish that understanding of how the human brain develops as we grow up. From there, we'll talk about how cannabis can affect not just our brains, but our body. We'll discuss best practices for reducing harms or potential risks associated with cannabis use. And finally, we'll wrap up our presentation by learning about support services available locally, regionally, provincially, and nationally for youth or providers that work with youth to support mental health and wellness. Now, as we mentioned, the first thing that we need to really discuss is what is cannabis? I mean, there's a lot of different names for cannabis. You've likely heard it referred to as marijuana or weed or pot or grass or dope. We know kids have all sorts of slang terms that they use for cannabis. I was doing a presentation for a group in Eastern Ontario a few weeks ago, and they were referring to it as the devil's lettuce. It has all sorts of colloquial names. But the operating term that we like to work with is cannabis because that is the correct technical and neutral term for the plant in and of itself. As I mentioned, cannabis itself is a scientific term for the hemp plant. It has a long history of use in many cultures, both for medicinal treatment as well as for recreation. And we know that its leaves and flowers contain psychoactive substances, one of which being THC or tetrahydrocannabinol, that can change the way that a person can think, feel, and act. Cannabis also contains many other compounds or cannabinoids, including CBD or cannabidiol, which we will also speak about today during this presentation. But the reason that we like to point these out is that YCAP does focus primarily on recreational cannabis use. And any conversations about the medicinal sides of cannabis or the potential medicinal applications of cannabis are best suited for an individual to have that sort of a conversation with their healthcare provider, to seek that information and to research it through accredited resources, many of which we can provide you with if you'd like to learn more. Did I miss anything there, Meg? Is there anything you'd add there?
No, I think that's a great summary. And if you have any additional questions about cannabis, hopefully we'll be able to answer it in the presentation, or not, you can put it in the chat and we'll be happy to get to that as well.
Absolutely. So like I said, we wanted to really establish that basal knowledge that this is what the cannabis plant is in and of itself. We know that cannabis has been legal for medical uses in Canada since the early 2000s and for recreational use since 2018, of course, with legal ages being set at 19 in all provinces except Alberta, where the age is 18, and Quebec, where it is 21. Now, an interesting note about Quebec increasing their age limit, their legal age from 18 to 21, is that the reason that they did increase the age was due to the research and emerging information about the potential risks of adolescent cannabis use and brain development. So it's a very interesting sort of a segue into the conversation that we're going to have today. And if we're going to talk about the brain, we need to really understand, how does it develop as we grow up? Meg, I'll turn it over to you for this.
Yeah, so basically, as we move into this next section, we're really going to be diving deep into examining the different processes that our brain undergoes during this critical development period during adolescence. So we'll review some different processes and some basic structure of the brain, just as a foundation to start this conversation. We would like to do a quick poll question here. Just asking, do you think a person's brain will continue to develop well into their 20s? Would you say this is a true statement or a false statement? Yeah, feel free to put your answers in the chat. Seeing a lot of responses come in. Everyone is saying true. That is amazing. A couple more seconds. Yeah, well, it seems like the overall response is true, and that is completely correct. So the brain development happens intensively during adolescence, and it continues until a person is in their mid-20s, with typical brain development finishing at the age of 25. But again, this is going to be different for each person. So we may see that earlier, we may see it later. It all depends on individual differences and factors. But overall, it is 25. And this is going to become an important topic as we continue into our harm reduction strategies. So diving a little bit deeper into the foundations of the brain and what it is composed of, we'll talk about a little bit about neurons. So within the brain, there are billions of specialized cells that make up the brain tissue and the nervous system called neurons. And neurons are basically just informational messengers that are responsible for processing input from the external world and sending messages or signals to the different parts of the brain and throughout the nervous system. And what do they do? So neurons basically just communicate information throughout the nervous system in different muscles and different parts of the brain. And they do this through electrical and chemical signals.
All right. Now, one of the things that we really want to try to explain is the brain undergoes sort of two major processes during adolescence that do tie into this discussion of cannabis use. And the first is the idea of what we know as myelination. Now, myelin, in and of themselves, are sort of a thick insulator that sit on the neuron. I kind of think of them almost like a superconductor, right? Their job is to help the neuron strengthen itself and communicate information faster. Now, the way that neurons sort of develop these sheaths that we know them as is by sort of being used on a regular basis. As certain neurons are firing and sending responses to and from and around in the brain undergoes this process of myelination to strengthen these connections. In essence, what the brain is learning how to do is how to learn and process information. And the skills and the tasks and the ways that it does so is through repetition and through practice. There are educators listening today. There are youth service providers listening today. There are social workers listening today. One of the things that we always talk to youth about is the importance of practice. Why do they go to school? They learn skills. Why do they do practice for sports so they can improve their skills at game time? Myelination is something that comes with practice as well. The more that we work on a specific skill, whether that's playing an instrument, learning how to draw, reading a book, conducting mathematical equations and formulae, the more that we do this, our brain learns to strengthen the connections in and of itself to the processes that need to be done. And this continues to occur on a fairly steady basis throughout adolescence. Okay? Essentially, the more we practice something, the better we become at it. We tell kids this all the time. We tell young people this all the time. This is really the neurological sort of reasoning behind why we explain this. The more we do something, the better we get at it. Now, on the other hand, while the brain is myelinating and strengthening these connections, the second process that takes place during adolescence is referred to as what we call synaptic pruning. Now, this does sound like somewhat of a complex term, so we can simplify it. Essentially, while the brain is strengthening pathways through myelination to the processes and skills and thoughts and ideas that we're doing on a regular basis, the ones that are not being used, the pathways that are not getting attention, begin to get pruned away. They begin to sort of get separated or not strengthened. They almost, in essence, sort of become thinned out, so to speak. So while the frequently used connections get stronger, the synapses, which are the gaps sort of between where the neurons send their information, begin to get scythed away or sheathed away or pruned away as they're not being used. Now, why do we talk about this with cannabis? Why do we talk about these two things? Here's why. With myelination, one of the things that we've learned is when an individual begins to do an activity, the more that they start to do it, the brain trains itself to almost want to do that activity more. It's almost like if we exercise and we exercise on a more frequent basis, you'll notice the people that exercise regularly tend to want to exercise regularly. This is something that especially happens during adolescence. This is why youth are better at picking up sort of habits and new behaviors and new skills. Cannabis use, unfortunately, can be sort of one of an example of this, or rather no exception. If an individual begins using cannabis during their adolescence, especially since we know that THC in cannabis can cause a rather sort of synthetic release of some of the pleasure-seeking neurotransmitters, which we'll speak about a little bit later, the brain learns that this is a process that is not only pleasurable, but it learns how to do it more. So the research suggests that heavy and regular cannabis use during adolescence almost teaches the brain to want to continue to do it more, which could tie into the reason why we see issues with dependency and addiction with cannabis being a little bit higher with youth than for individuals who start using cannabis after the brain has fully developed at age 25. Now, what about synaptic pruning? Research suggests that early exposure to THC in cannabis may cause the brain to begin to prune away important connections quicker. And so what would happen is the brain sort of struggles to learn new skills as these processes get pruned away. And the use of cannabis may actually cause this process to be alleviated or to be expedited, to happen quicker, right? So in essence, we talk about the idea of using a connection, it becomes myelinated. Not using it, the synapse becomes pruned. It's similar to the idea of skill building. If we don't use it, we lose it. And when it comes to cannabis, if the brain uses cannabis during adolescence, it learns to want to use it, or it can learn to want to use it. But at the same time, the THC increases the process of pruning, which causes more of a loss or a struggle with mastering new skills. And we do have that explained here. The idea that we also like to note is that THC in cannabis, research does suggest, can also weaken myelin sheaths in and of themselves. I mentioned a few minutes ago that a myelin sheath is that conductor that strengthens and increases the speed of a connection between sort of the signals that are going on between one neuron to the next. So what can actually happen is while the neuron is passing information along at a normal speed, and I'll say a normal speed for lack of a better term, research does suggest that if the individual uses cannabis while the brain is myelinating, this process can be weakened and it can slow down. And again, as I mentioned, the continuous use of cannabis can teach the brain to find the experience of use, even though it may be compromising certain processes. The experience of use becomes desirable. Now, there is limited knowledge on what exactly are sort of the mechanisms behind this, as the research is based on acute and heavy cannabis use only. So this is not to say that if a youth uses cannabis once, that this is going to happen. That's not what we're saying. The research that we see here is mostly on heavy, acute, and regular use, which is also part of the reason that we suggest to youth to avoid the use of cannabis before 25, but also if they are considering using, that there's an importance in limiting use. So again, we see the idea that the developing neuron with healthy myelin sheaths, which have been myelinated cleanly, you're noticing that the process on the left is moving fairly quickly. There's a signal that's moving at a fairly consistent pace. But the weakened myelin sheath on the right, potentially caused by the presence of THC in a developing brain, you'll notice sends signals slower, which allows the information to pass along more slowly. Is there anything you'd like to add there, Meg?
You did a great job explaining that, Steve. I will just mention that in practical use, when we do see a weakened myelin sheath and that slower signaling, what this can translate to is that we might find in a youth that maybe they're taking a longer time to learn or master a skill. Maybe they're struggling a bit in school because they're having problems retaining and processing new learning or new knowledge. So just a little bit of an example of how this could actually look in an individual is that they may struggle with learning, they may struggle with regulating their emotions, all these different things that could impact daily life and daily functioning. And we will be talking about this more later on as we examine further the different regions of the brain that we do see THC interact with.
Absolutely. Now, not only are we going to talk about how THC and cannabis interact with the brain, but Meg, how does cannabis interact with the human body?
Yeah, exactly. So within our human body, there is the endocannabinoid system that we can see on this slide here. So the endocannabinoid system is a complex biological signaling network that helps us maintain balance within our bodies. Now, Steve, what are some ways that you can think of that our bodies naturally try to balance itself out?
If we're talking about natural balance in the body, I guess that would be things like eating food on a regular basis. I know when I haven't eaten in a while, my sense of mental and physical balance might get a little thrown off. Maybe the idea of sleep.
Very important. Yeah, so if we're hungry or we're thirsty, then that's our body telling us that we need to eat or we need to drink something. Sleep is also a really great example. We exert a lot of energy throughout the day, so we need to recover that by getting a good night's sleep and restore our cells in our body. And then lastly, a good example is also temperature regulation. So when we exercise, maybe in a high intensity sport or something, we'll tend to sweat. And that's our body's natural way to regulate our temperature, to cool us down, to reach that balance. So there are many different functions that our bodies do to keep ourselves balanced that we can notice in our everyday life. Now, an additional function of the endocannabinoid system is also to dial down neuron activity and the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine. And this is all to maintain balance within the body. So it helps to regulate the release of chemicals that affect our mood, our motivation, our memory, and our growth. So we can see this is pretty an essential system that cannabis is interacting with. So we can see a little bit more about what the endocannabinoid system is made up and how it works. So our bodies naturally produce cannabinoids, which are also found in the cannabis plant. And these cannabinoids work as messengers to send signals from one cell to another by binding to cannabinoid receptors that are present in our cell membranes. So we can see that on this little diagram here, we'll have these little dots and they'll move into the cannabinoid receptors in our cell membranes. And basically what this is doing is it's evoking a chemical reaction within the body. So the cannabinoids are binding to that receptor, and then we're going to experience a chemical reaction. And that is how we will either feel the effects of the cannabinoids within our body or within the plant. Yeah, so a little bit more into these different cannabinoids that are found in our bodies and in our plants. In a second here, perfect. Yeah, so we find them naturally within our bodies, and these are called endocannabinoids, endo just meaning within. And these are the chemicals that are produced in our body that act on the endocannabinoid system. Now, we also see cannabinoids called phytocannabinoids, and those are what are found in the cannabis plant. And they are also acting on the endocannabinoid system to evoke a reaction. So this would be what we see with THC and CBD. They're creating a chemical reaction that is going to result in the felt effects of cannabis.
Absolutely. Now, sort of building off that idea of those receptors, we know that they're actually located throughout the body. And when you actually think of the endocannabinoid system, it makes a lot of sense. Meg, you alluded to the fact earlier that the endocannabinoid system is responsible for things like maintaining balance in our energy levels, our temperature regulation, our mood and our focus, and even things like pain tolerance, right?
Yeah.
If you actually look at where the receptors are in the body, this actually makes a lot of sense. Endocannabinoid receptors are located on the cells of some of the systems in our body, like the nervous system, the digestive system, and the immune system. There are two different types of receptors. We have CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors. And what we found about cannabis is the research does suggest that those two active cannabinoids that we mentioned not too long ago, CBD and THC, will actually bind a little bit differently to these different types of receptors. For instance, CB1 receptors are these orange receptors you see on the diagram on the right. And you'll notice that a lot of them are located in two places. One is in the stomach and in the digestive system, but the other's up here in the brain. THC tends to bind quite aggressively to CB1 receptors, which may explain why THC can cause sort of mind-altering effects when a person is using THC-based cannabis products. Now, CB2 receptors we do find primarily in the intestinal tract and the digestive system, but we also find it in the nervous system and sort of in the muscular system throughout the body. So what you're noticing is a lot of the research and the things that we see about CBD, which tends to be more so seen for its medicinal applications and medical purposes, including things like helping with inflammation or response to pain, especially chronic pain, or potential appetite stimulation or suppression of nausea and vomiting. You'll notice that a lot of the receptors in the body that tend to bind and interact with CBD tend to be found in those regions whereby those sorts of effects would need to be felt. So it's very interesting when you actually look at the ECS system and where it's connected in the body, and especially how cannabis interacts with different parts of the body. So to answer the question, where in the body do we actually find the endocannabinoid system? It's not like a digestive system that we find it sort of mostly in the torso, so to speak, in the stomach. It's not like the respiratory system that we find sort of in the chest and in the lungs and with the windpipe. The endocannabinoid system is everywhere. It's located throughout the human body. Now, in the body, we do also have, especially in the brain, we do have sort of transmitters that communicate information chemically back and forth. And Meg, you mentioned this earlier when you talked about how neurons pass information electrically, but they also pass it chemically, right? Mm-hmm. Neurotransmitters are those chemical messengers that are passed back and forth between different neurons within the brain. Now, important neurotransmitters for development include things like dopamine, melatonin, serotonin, and gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA. And the focal point that we really want to look at, the one neurotransmitter that tends to get a lot more attention when we're looking at cannabis in the brain, it tends to be dopamine. Now, dopamine deals with the pleasure and reward system in the body. This is sort of a neurotransmitter that's released that makes us feel happy, that makes us feel motivated and satisfied with the things that we do. It's released when we do something that makes us feel good. Getting an A when we're in class as a student, going out and having a Big Mac when we go to McDonald's, going out and having a salad because we probably knew the Big Mac was not all that great for us at McDonald's. It's that good feeling that we get when we do something that we enjoy, right? And the release of dopamine provides us with the motivation to seek out pleasurable experiences once again. Now, with that in mind, our second poll question is this. THC can actually change the way that the brain produces dopamine. Is this true or is this false?
A lot of responses coming in, majority of them saying true.
We have a very knowledgeable audience. Meg, do you want to elaborate on this one?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, we do see that THC does impact the way that our brains produce dopamine. So this makes us feel more happy, more motivated, more focused. And then our brain in turn produces more dopamine in response to using cannabis. And it can train the brain to feel this pleasure and this happiness from the input of THC. And the more dopamine that a brain produces, it will require it to feel more levels or similar levels. And then we can see where we're building this dependency or this tolerance as our brain continues to seek out more dopamine in response to engaging in THC. So basically, THC makes the neurons release dopamine at higher levels than in what is normal, resulting in this high or euphoric feeling that comes with using cannabis. And as a person continues to use cannabis over time, the brain's receptors become less responsive to dopamine, and the effect of dopamine gets weaker because our brains are getting used to this input. This makes us seek out more dopamine by using more cannabis to feel the same amount of pleasure as we did before. And then that's how we develop a tolerance or become at risk for developing dependency or cannabis use disorder. Now, youth are particularly at risk of developing a dependency on cannabis because their brains haven't fully discovered what alternative activities trigger natural dopamine. So if a person uses cannabis during their teenage years, it distracts them from pursuing other activities that naturally release dopamine. And instead, the brain has identified cannabis as the main source of interest and motivation. This can then program the brain to crave cannabis to feel joy and myelinate that pathway to strengthen that behavior of cannabis use.
Absolutely. And one thing I will add in the research into dopamine is that research does suggest increasingly that as the brain sort of pumps dopamine through and responds to the dopamine neurotransmitter, there is a possibility that over time, the receptors in the brain sort of become almost a little bit dulled to the presence of dopamine, which can actually mean that the brain almost sort of requires more dopamine than it used to elicit the same reactions that it once did. So in the case of cannabis use, if we know that THC can cause a synthetic or a pumping through of dopamine into the brain, research does suggest that doing this over a longer period of time may cause the brain to respond less to this neurotransmitter than it used to, which would actually require the brain to almost need more than it once did as it's increasing its tolerance to the presence of this neurotransmitter. Sorry, Meg, you were saying?
Yeah, so we can see that instead of using THC as a way to boost our dopamine levels, there are actually a lot of different healthy ways that we can increase our natural dopamine levels. So what are some ways, I want to ask the audience, what are some ways that you engage in or activities that you do to help yourself feel better or to give you a boost of energy or motivation? What are some ways that we could use? Exercise, okay, seeing a couple of responses for exercise, which is a great one. Someone does yoga. Music, yeah, if you really love listening to music, that is a great way to boost your dopamine. Being in nature, engaging in your hobbies, spending time with friends and family is a really great activity as well. Hugs, that's a cute one, yeah. All right, those are all awesome, awesome comments here. And you really touched on a lot of the ways that we suggest engaging in natural dopamine levels. So Steve, what do we have up on the slide here? Yeah, so some other examples would be just eating a healthy diet. So making sure you're having a nutritious diet and getting enough sleep. Sleep is really important to re-energize and rejuvenate our body. So we want to make sure we're taking care of it. Reading or meditating is also a great one, or engaging other hobbies that you like to enjoy. And yeah, getting that personal connection and support from friends or family is a really great way to have your natural dopamine levels boosted as well. Now we are going to go into a little bit more about how THC affects different regions of our brain. And we can see THC affecting the regions that specifically control movement, learning, emotions, and decision making. Now, the reason we see these regions of the brain impacted by THC is because they're primarily regulated by dopamine in one way or another. So whether that's for meeting our basic needs, like getting enough food or water, providing us with a sense of motivation or feelings of excitement, the brain relies on dopamine for a lot of its normal functioning. So let's dive into this a little bit more. So first, looking at movement. So the two regions of the brain responsible for movement are the cerebellum and the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is the higher arrow on the screen, and the cerebellum is located more at the base of the brain. And their functions are primarily voluntary movement coordination, balance, posture, and face and object recognition. So we use these areas of our brain daily for tasks like walking, typing on a keyboard, skimming through a dense paragraph of text, but ultimately just interpreting the information from our eyes and turning it into the world that we see it. And these movement regions of our brain also help us navigate through physical spaces using coordination and recognition of familiar objects. Now, Steve, what happens when we introduce THC into this system?
Well, one of the things that we know is that THC can impair coordination and alertness. And so these sort of functions are really necessary for things that we kind of take for granted that we can do in many cases, but they're things that become far more difficult when an individual is impaired by a substance like cannabis. These include things like playing an instrument, reading a book, riding a bike, hand-eye coordination, sports. And that idea of hand-eye coordination can be very complex when we're talking about things like operating a vehicle. One thing that we know is that when we see drivers that are impaired by cannabis, or we see research about drivers that are impaired by cannabis, the research suggests that an individual who uses cannabis before driving is less capable of maintaining distance from the vehicle in front of them as their depth perception is being thrown off. They're also less capable of maintaining their speed on the road, staying within their lane, and responding to the changes of what's really going on around them. For example, a person stepping out in front of them, or an animal jumping out, or a light changing, or a vehicle stopping in front of them very suddenly. So again, there's this idea of safety that can become quite compromised if an individual is impaired by THC from cannabis, as these parts of the brain are being impacted by the presence of tetrahydrocannabinol. Because when cannabis is consumed, these regions tend to be flooded with THC. And so when people consume cannabis, they may also experience or report things like time moving slower than it used to. Or they may notice that things seem further away than they normally would, or they can't really quite judge something, or if they're having a conversation with a person that they know but not very well, you may notice they take a little longer to recognize them than they used to. Meg?
Yeah, that's awesome. Great explanations there, and some really great examples onto how this actually applies in everyday life. So now we're going to talk about the parts of the brain that are responsible for emotions. So we have the amygdala, which is the arrow pointing on the left, which rapidly assesses incoming information from our environment and chooses how to react to that situation. So it's critical for emotional regulation and for our fight and flight response to help us identify threats and dangers and react accordingly to keep us safe. We also see the nucleus accumbens, which is the arrow on the right, which is responsible for motivation and is the site where dopamine is released. So it makes it the center for the pleasure and reward system, which activates when we do things that bring us joy or excite us. Steve?
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that we know about THC is that it can interfere with the signals that we would sort of normally react to. These are things like a healthy fear in an unsafe situation, or responding in an emotional manner that would be appropriate for a given situation. For instance, if someone's telling us a story that's quite serious, making sure that we react sort of with a serious and a calm response, as opposed to laughing or overreacting to the situation. Now, one of the things we also know about the amygdala is that it can also be responsible for mood regulation in adulthood, dealing with sort of overwhelming senses of emotion. And the presence of THC in the amygdala can complicate this. And not only the presence of THC, but the accompanying release of dopamine. If you look at the model of the brain, you'll notice that the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens are right beside each other. The nucleus accumbens is that pleasure-seeking center of the brain. And we know that THC can change dopamine levels. And we know that those dopamine levels are usually released by things like identifying passions, drives, motivations, the things that we like, doing the things that bring us passion, the hobbies, the skills, and even seeing the people that we care about or spending time with our pets. I like that comment that people made about spending time with their pets. The presence of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens increases that desire and that drive. So as cannabis releases more of a synthetic level of dopamine, this can rewire an adolescent or developing brain to perceive cannabis as being more valuable than it otherwise might be to someone who's fully developed. At that point, in their mid-20s or their late 20s, whereby the brain is more developed. And we actually see this when rates of dependency are higher with teens, like I said, than people who begin use after 25. Now, the presence of dopamine in the amygdala can also cause feelings of anxiety or fear or tension. This can also be why when an individual is impaired by THC, you may notice that they exhibit or they show signs of like euphoria and excitement because the nucleus accumbens is being activated, but they may also exhibit signs of things like paranoia and anxiety or panic attacks because the amygdala is being activated at the same time. So we're sort of seeing two different parts of the brain that have very differing effects being impacted by the presence of THC and dopamine in completely different ways. This is part of the reason that impairment can be so different from one person who may feel euphoric and excitement and joy from THC versus the other person that may feel a sense of paranoia or an overwhelming feeling of anxiety. How about learning, Meg? What can we say about that?
Yeah, so we also see THC affecting the areas that are important for learning, which are the thalamus, so the arrow on the right, and the hippocampus, the arrow on the left. So these two regions work like a filing cabinet when the brain receives information or external stimuli. So it's basically the information processing hub responsible for our memories, our cognitive functioning, and important executive functioning there as well, and just visual processing as well. So very critical areas of the brain that are responsible for learning that we use in our everyday life.
Absolutely. And we know that the presence of cannabis in the brain can interfere with a lot of these functions that tend to go on when it comes to learning. This can be things like memorizing, picking up new sequences, learning a new task at a job, understanding information that's being communicated to us for, say, developing a project or working on a slide deck. I mean, my work is curriculum development. One of the things I have to do is understand how to sort of change and develop new pieces of material as they're coming in. We also know that cannabis can interfere with things like academic performance, the ability to sort of achieve those higher functioning levels of learning. But one of the other things of interest is that cannabis can also have differing effects on sleep cycles. Research has shown that cannabis can change and impact melatonin levels, but not necessarily in a one-size-fits-all manner. You may notice some people who say they use cannabis because it helps them sleep. Someone else may try to use cannabis hearing that it might help them sleep, but instead they're up all night because the effect on the brain may be different from one person to the next. This is why you may not hear cannabis sort of being universally prescribed as a sleep aid, because for some people it may help, but for other people it may actually disrupt their sleep cycles.
And lastly, we have the prefrontal cortex, which is mainly responsible for decision making. So this includes executive functioning, working memory, inhibitory control, and mental flexibility. So let's just break these functions down one by one. So executive functioning refers to cognitive processes that our brains perform, including paying attention, organizing and planning, staying focused, making complex decisions. So basically, it allows us to carry out critical everyday tasks. Now, working memory is the capacity to hold information in our heads over a short period of time. So it enables us to remember a phone number long enough to dial it, to return to a place in our book before our friend interrupted us, and allows us to follow multi-step instructions without constant reminders. And inhibitory control is the skill we use to master and filter out our thoughts and impulses so we can resist temptations, distractions, and make us pause before and think before we act. So this capacity basically helps us prevent us from acting completely impulsively and doing whatever we want. It's also the skill that we rely on to bite our tongue and say something nice rather than like saying our true emotions. And lastly, we have cognitive or mental flexibility. So this is the capacity to switch gears and adjust to change demands, priorities, or perspectives. So it's what helps us apply different rules in different settings based on social norms or social conventions. Now, what happens when THC affects this area of the brain, Steve?
Well, with these higher level processes, we know that THC can actually reduce brain performance of the executive functions that are necessary for more complex things we do in our life. This includes things like not just learning new information, but more importantly, organizing it and creating and synthesizing it into new ideas. It can also impact our ability to make sound judgments. Say, for instance, that a teen or a young adult, and this could happen with any age, but we are talking about adolescence here, is at a party and they designated a driver, which is great. They planned ahead, but maybe that driver leaves early in the night. And another friend who's had some cannabis says, you know what, I can drive. I don't feel that impaired. We know this is a very risky situation. This is a potentially dangerous situation. If the youth who's looking for a ride has also been using cannabis, the presence of THC in the brain may prevent sort of that higher level functioning of being able to identify and assess the situation that they're getting themselves into, to the point that they may be more likely to get into a vehicle with a driver who's impaired by cannabis. And we have actually seen this in the national reporting data. In fact, in the 2021 Canadian Cannabis Survey, it was estimated that teens and young adults who reported consuming cannabis in the past 12 months were 5 times more likely, or up to 5 times more likely, to get into a vehicle with a driver who had used cannabis within the past couple of hours than an individual who did not report using cannabis in the past 12 months. So it becomes very important for individuals that if they are using cannabis, if there's anything complicated they need to do, whether that's school or whether that's work, that they may want to consider if that's an appropriate time to use cannabis or if they should be focusing on those responsibilities. And certainly, if they're planning on traveling or going anywhere, it becomes very important that they designate a driver and plan ahead, but more importantly, have a backup plan in case the first plan falls through.
Now, I will just mention a question from the chat, Steve, that maybe you can help answer. Is someone is asking how long someone should wait before driving after using cannabis?
That's an excellent question. Now, one of the things that we know is that THC can remain in the body for a fairly extended period of time. And when it comes to consuming cannabis through an inhalation, whether that's smoking, dabbing, or vaping, we know that the effects will be felt fairly quickly, right? An individual may actually begin to feel impaired within a couple minutes after they smoke a joint or after they take a hit from a bong or they pull from a vape pen. That impairment will generally peak around the 30-minute mark and then begin to slowly wear off. Although the individual still may exhibit signs of impairment for a period of up to 6 hours or even 12 hours in some cases. So if an individual has used cannabis and is thinking of traveling, I would generally recommend that the minimum that they wait is actually about a 24-hour period. Because even when they come down from that impairment, one of the things that we know is that they may begin to feel burned out or they may begin to feel exhausted. And that's where they may run into a different problem. They may not be driving while impaired, but they're driving while fatigued. And fatigue impairment can also be a significant risk to drivers on the road. Now, the second reason that I suggest 24 hours to wait has to do with ingested cannabis. Edibles and beverages take effect far more slowly than inhaled cannabis products. And actually, one of our other workshops titled Let's Talk About Cannabis, we actually really explore that in greater detail. But really what I'm going to explain here is an individual that takes an edible or has a cannabis beverage, they may not actually begin to be affected by the presence of THC in their system for a period of up to even 4 hours. So while that person who smoked cannabis or vaped cannabis may begin to feel less symptoms or effects, shall we say, of impairment at the 6-hour mark or the 8-hour mark or the 10-hour mark or the 12-hour mark, the individual who consumed an edible is just starting to feel it a few hours in. And those effects can last an entire 24-hour period. So my recommendation is if you're planning on traveling anywhere on, say, a Friday, if you use cannabis, I would avoid getting behind the wheel of a car until at least Saturday. Especially with an edible, you may have to wait a full 24-hour window. Did I miss anything there, Meg?
No, I think you covered it all. And I think that's really great for not only adults to know, but also to pass along to youth too, because they may have this perception of that they might not feel it after a couple hours. And then that just means that they're completely not impaired anymore and they're good to go. But really, it's still in your system. And that's really important to have that knowledge and be able to teach that knowledge as well.
Absolutely. And I do like pointing it out to adults as well, because we did see research around the period of legalization that drivers, especially older drivers, had a perception that cannabis impairment wasn't really like sort of that big of a deal versus, say, alcohol impairment. And in fact, what we've actually seen in the roadside data that was reported as recently in 2019 is that there was a higher percentage of drivers who reported consuming cannabis that would have tested positive for impairment than the drivers who reported consuming alcohol that would test positive for alcohol impairment. We're seeing and we're understanding the risks of alcohol impaired driving to the point that we've actually seen alcohol impaired driving cases declining over the last 15 years. However, the number of cases of cannabis impaired driving has been increasing. Now, to be fair, part of that is because there is increased testing and education and training on how to conduct that testing. So that definitely does factor in. But this presence or this increase is concerning, and it still becomes important to echo and communicate that idea that just like driving impaired by alcohol, driving impaired by cannabis can be quite dangerous. And in a 2013 roadside study conducted by the CCSA, it was estimated that drivers that consumed cannabis before driving were up to 5 times more likely to be involved in a fatal collision. And drivers that consumed cannabis and alcohol together were up to 40 times more likely to be involved in a fatal collision. So at the end of the day, if a person's using a substance, they need to make sure they're designating a driver and getting in a vehicle with a sober driver.
Got a comment in the chat about it's hard to have the a lack of guidelines when it comes to that kind of rule. We can only say we can exercise it with the most caution necessary, but that makes it hard to pass along to youth when you want concrete guidelines. It is sort of a guessing game, but we always just try to promote exercising as much caution as we can as a form of harm reduction, right? So whether that's realistic or not, that's kind of the rules that we abide by.
Absolutely. And I see a really great comment here from someone in the audience that says the 24-hour guideline is helpful, but if a youth or an individual smokes cannabis on a daily basis, that may feel like you're telling them they can't drive at all. Unfortunately, for some youth, that may be a situation that they have to consider sort of what is their focus in that moment. It's like the idea of if they're planning on going to class or if they're planning on going to work, they really don't want to be showing up impaired. Not just that they may struggle to learn or focus on their tasks, but they could be a little bit more of a safety risk, especially in the workplace. It's the same thing with driving. And we know not only the human costs of impaired driving can be significant, but the legal ramifications of driving while impaired can be astronomical, especially for teens and young adults. And this is actually something I find helpful when you're having a discussion with teens, is to show them the financial ramifications. It's not a scare tactic. I mean, it can be daunting, but it's a reality. It's a fact that they can see and really understand tangibly, that the cost for an impaired driving charge or an offense on a record, and not just on a record, but the cost of the insurance increase in Ontario can be as high as $6,000 a year. The reinstatement fee can be several $100s. The impound of the car can be several $100s. We actually conducted the math on it about a year ago, and we found here in Ontario that an individual that was, say, pulled over for an impaired driving, if they did test positive and were charged for impaired driving, the financial cost over a 3-year window could be as high as $30,000. Not to mention the fact that if they had a job or were employed in a job that required them to travel, if they had a DUI on their driving record, they may not be able to secure that job. So that guideline is helpful for the human cause. But one of the things I have found that's helpful is to really make sure that youth understand sort of the financial ramification, not just the penalty, but the potential impact on their future employment. That they do understand that we're not trying to say they can never use cannabis, but if they are thinking of using, they need to understand the importance of safe travel. That makes sense. Did I miss anything there, Meg?
No, I think that's a great strategy as well. If someone needs to be convinced a little bit more, always looking at the financial side is pretty daunting experience and does question some decisions and behaviors that they make in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we don't want to just use scare tactics. We're not trying to just terrify kids out of this, because we know scare tactics don't work. But a tangible, concrete number there is something that they can at least see and understand and make sure that they're making a healthy choice and the focus is on their choice. Now, to review the things that we went over the last few slides, we have this understanding that different sort of functions in the brain are controlled by different regions. And Meg, you did a masterful job explaining the regulatory sort of bodies, right? The amygdala with fear and anxiety, the nucleus accumbens with motivation and reward. And we see the effects of THC actually having sort of changes in the way that the brain functions. And again, the example I always find intriguing is that THC can cause feelings of euphoria and pleasure as it passes through the nucleus accumbens, but also paranoia and panic as it passes through the amygdala. So I do like this slide because I find it summarizes it very well. It's a lot of information, but we did cover it over the last several slides. Now, what are the actual health risks of cannabis use to a developing brain? In many of our other presentations, we talk about the risks in general, right? We talk about the physical risks, the potential risks of increased risk of myocardial infarction or stroke for individuals that have a history of heart conditions, or the irritation or potential damage to blood vessels within the lungs from smoking cannabis. But Meg, what are the specific health risks to the developing brain associated with cannabis use?
Yeah, so we have them all listed on the next slide, but using cannabis early on in life, or using frequently, or using strong products can lead to many different health risks and mental health conditions like psychological disorders or schizophrenia, anxiety and depression, even developing cannabis use disorder, and also impairing attention and memory. Now let's talk a little bit more about each of these in more detail. So let's first look at anxiety and depression. So while some people may use cannabis to cope with anxiety, heavy use of cannabis and or higher THC potency products like extracts or concentrates that one would dab or vape are all associated with greater risks of experiencing panic attacks and increased anxiety, particularly those who are new to cannabis use or are inexperienced in using it. And that is because we just reviewed what that happens in the brain when it comes to the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens. So we do see that it is possible to increase anxiety if we use these high THC potency products. And if you go ahead on the slide, Steve, we will see the text boxes come up. Perfect. So over to depression, research also shows that regular cannabis use is associated with higher rates of depression, especially among adolescents that use cannabis during this critical developing period. So the research into cannabis and mental health conditions is still being developed and still being refined. But overall, right now, we're seeing that regular cannabis use is generally linked to more harms than benefits for individuals with mental health conditions or with family or medical histories of mental health conditions. So there is a pretty big misconception or myth that using cannabis will help treat anxiety or help you relax, alleviate stress. And that could be the case for some individuals, but it's not a definite across all cases. So we do want to be cautious when using cannabis as a medical treatment. Again, it's not recommended unless you talk to your healthcare provider or clinician or psychologist, psychiatrist to see if that is right for you and whether this will help the condition or really just worsen it, which is what we see in most cases, unfortunately. So what are some ways that we can keep safe? So what are some harm reduction strategies here? So an important harm reduction strategy is to develop alternative coping mechanisms. So while some people use cannabis as a way to make themselves feel better, continued reliance on substances to cope can lead to problematic use later on. Instead, we can focus on engaging in healthier strategies that give us a boost of dopamine naturally. So we really brainstormed some of these earlier on. So these would be doing your hobbies or activities that you enjoy, exercising, listening to music, spending time with friends, or even seeking mental health support from a professional. Also, to reduce the health risks, we want to use cannabis less frequently and in lower amounts, so using sparingly. So maybe this looks like cutting down one's cannabis use to only occurring on the weekends or a few days a week, or deciding not to use if you're going to school or going to work. In those times, we really need to use all of our attention and focus. Additionally, using in lower amounts throughout the day is also recommended. So instead of using chronically throughout the day, limit your use to maybe only using once a day, maybe in the evenings or in the morning, for example.
Absolutely. Now, what is it that we could say about attention and memory? One of the things that we know about cannabis intoxication is that it has been linked to deficits in things like being able to pay attention and to really focus on an idea or on a task at hand. We also know that it can compromise one's ability to process new information. As we know, it passes through sort of those learning sections of the brain. The impairment caused by THC, we know can really complicate this idea. We also know that intoxication can compromise things like fine motor skills and coordination, which is very important for things like driving or operating heavy machinery or playing sports, as well as impacting things like reaction time. Again, important for those sort of high intensity activities. We also know that long-term regular use of cannabis since adolescence has also been associated in research with impairments in things like attention, memory, as well as verbal learning. So it really becomes important for people to consider various harm reduction strategies, and we talked about these throughout the presentation. We know that there are still youth that will choose to use cannabis. I sometimes get asked if our goal is to make people say no. We're not a just say no program. We understand that youth have choice. We understand that people make choice. This presentation, we try to highlight as much as we can why it's important for youth to delay their use until age 25. But some may still choose to use. And no matter who they are, no matter at what age they are, if they're 12 years old, if they're 18 years old, if they're 25 years old, if they're 35 years old, these harm reduction strategies are still important, not just for their attention and memory, but for their overall health and safety. We want to make sure that they plan a safe ride. We talked about that in depth earlier. We want to make sure that they consider their responsibility in the workplace, at school, at home, the responsibility to commitments that they've made. If it's spending time with friends or spending time with loved ones, that they're showing up with a clear mind so they can enjoy themselves. One of the signs we know of dependent behavior, and we'll talk about this a little more later, is when people give up their responsibilities or focus less on their responsibilities in favor of substance use, in this situation, cannabis. So we want to make sure that they put those responsibilities, those needs that they have, ahead of the wants. It's almost like a financial literacy discussion when it comes to mortgaging your time and mortgaging your focus. It's planning the things that you need to do first, the things that really matter. And again, delaying use until age 25. Meg?
Yeah, so now we're going to touch on psychotic disorders and schizophrenia as it relates to cannabis. So although the exact underlying mechanism is still largely unknown, there is strong evidence that using cannabis may increase the risk of an individual developing psychosis or schizophrenia, especially those who have an existing family history or medical history of these conditions already. Now, even with individuals who don't have this history, they still do have a risk of developing psychotic disorders or schizophrenia. So beginning cannabis use at an early age, using daily or almost daily, or using high THC potency products may increase the risk of developing psychosis or schizophrenia. So how can we engage in harm reduction strategies here? So the first one, which could just be the first step, is to educate yourself about your risk profile. So learn about your family's medical history, see if there are any underlying mechanisms or vulnerabilities to these conditions that may be worsened by cannabis use. You can also engage in lower potency products. So we know that products with higher THC are associated more to the onset of psychotic conditions. So using lower potency products or products with higher levels of CBD in them can lower the risk of experiencing these conditions, as well as just experiencing the negative effects of cannabis use that one can also go through, like experiencing nausea, experiencing a heightened anxiety, or vomiting in the cases of over-intoxication or over-consuming. We also want to avoid all synthetic products like Spice or K2. These products are completely illegal in Canada, no matter what your age is. So it doesn't even relate to minors, it relates to everybody. These products are not real cannabis products, and they do have serious health effects associated with them. So these can include organ damage or organ failure, seizures, or even some cases of death. So you really want to educate yourself about the different products that are available on the market, the legal market, and avoid the illegal market where these products are sold to avoid running into any of these complications.
Absolutely. Now, the next risk that we do need to talk about, we've alluded to this several times, is the idea of cannabis use disorder. We are a neutral program. We are a balanced program. We are not saying that cannabis is or is not a problem. We are not saying that everyone that uses cannabis will struggle with dependency. Statistically, that's not true. but we understand that there is a significant percentage of individuals, particularly youth, who use cannabis who may be at risk. And cannabis use during adolescence, we know, is a risk factor of increasing the risk of developing a CUD, or a cannabis use disorder. While research has suggested that about 9% of people that use cannabis overall will report issues with dependency, that number nearly doubles to approximately 16% if the individual began using cannabis during their teenage and adolescent years. So what we like to point out is, what does cannabis use disorder look like? And it's not as simple as physically seeing an appearance of someone and saying by looking at them that they're struggling with cannabis use. There's more to it than that. We have to look for changes in behavior, changes in emotion, some physical changes, and certainly changes sort of in the psychology of what they're sort of doing. Are they struggling to stop cannabis use, or are they struggling to cut down? Or when they try to reduce their use, they start reporting things like feeling feverish or more stressed or more anxious when they're not using. Earlier, we mentioned that cannabis can complicate things like focus and attention to detail. If an individual is regularly reporting struggling to focus on responsibilities in their life, especially if they didn't have a history of that before using cannabis, this can be a sign of problematic use. If they're experiencing conflict with a family or friend about their use, even if the individual does not think the cannabis use is a problem, if someone else is seeing that, if they're seeing a change in that to the point that it's causing conflict in your personal or social life, this could be a sign of problematic use. If the individual is using on a daily or near daily basis, as we know, between 25 to 50% of daily users will report issues related to cannabis use disorder in their lifetime. Regular use at an early age, as I mentioned earlier. The use of cannabis is a primary coping mechanism, particularly a primary coping mechanism, to deal with depression, anxiety, stress, and problems. If someone once in a while chooses to use cannabis when they have the weekend off, and they plan to save for out to travel, and they've had a long week and they decide to use a little bit of cannabis to relax, I'm not saying that means they have a problem. It's not it at all. If they have other coping mechanisms as well, if they're still going out and exercising, spending time with loved ones, taking breaks for themselves, taking those mental health breaks to take care of themselves, they may use cannabis periodically or from time to time. It's when this becomes a primary coping mechanism and they're falling off and losing sight of the other mechanisms and strategies to deal with depression and with anxiety. This can be a sign of problematic use. If they're stealing or breaking the law to pay for cannabis-related purchases, or if they're breaking the law while impaired by cannabis or while recovering from cannabis impairment, if they're spending less time with friends or loved ones, and if they're needing more cannabis over time to feel the same effects. As I mentioned earlier, there's that potential of the effects of dopamine being dulled over time, that the individual may feel they need to use more cannabis to feel the same level of pleasure that they used to. Finally, the idea is a major or primary form of recreation to the point that their other interests begin to fall by the wayside. My slide jumped ahead there a little bit, I apologize. The use while driving, and finally, knowing the risks and still choosing to use. And again, having one of these pop up in someone's life does not automatically mean that they have a problem. Youth are aware of risks, adults are aware of risks of cannabis. If they still choose to use aware of those risks, that doesn't automatically mean they have a problem. But if they are choosing to use aware of the risks, if they have a psychological history of psychosis or of schizophrenia, and they're choosing to use, and they're getting behind the wheel of a car, and they're needing more over time, and they're beginning to feel increasingly unwell, they're aware of these risks they've chosen, and these are beginning to pop up, this could be a sign that this individual may need treatment or support for a disordered use of cannabis. So how do we keep safe? We recommend that individuals, if they are using cannabis, they start with a small amount, particularly things like edibles. They start with a small piece instead of eating the entire edible. With inhaled cannabis, perhaps they look at using dried leaf product instead of extract, or if they are choosing to vape, that they vape dried leaf products instead of concentrates, so that they're not burning that product as high and getting as many of the carcinogens, and they're not using a product that's as high in potency. And that they wait to see how they feel. If it's dried leaf product, vapes and dabs, they wait 10 to 20 minutes to see how they feel before deciding if they want to have more. If it's an edible, they're not going to like this, but have them wait a couple of hours before they decide if they want to have more. Avoid mixing with other substances, particularly things like alcohol, stimulants, depressants, and opioids. And understand that if an individual is affected with a cannabis use disorder, or you suspect they may be, or if you suspect you are, it's okay to access support services, and we will get to those in the next few minutes. Meg?
Yeah, so when we talk about cannabis use disorder, we refer to it as existing on a spectrum. So each person's cannabis use is going to be different and it's going to impact their lives in different ways. So at one end of the spectrum, we have those who choose not to use cannabis at all. And because of that, they're not going to experience any negative effects from it. Moving along the spectrum, we have those who are maybe at a low risk. So they are using cannabis, but they're setting limits for themselves and they're engaging in those harm reduction strategies that we've been talking about. So they're not going to experience as many negative effects. Those with problematic use might start to have conflicts within their relationships, or cannabis is beginning to affect their school or work performance. And at the very end of the cannabis spectrum, we see cannabis use disorder or dependency, which we have just been talking about. So this can happen when cannabis use doesn't feel like a choice anymore, but more of a need. So we're building that dependency. And someone might be using it as their main form of a coping strategy. And this is all going to increase the risk of experiencing harm. But most importantly, what's important to understand here is that people can move either way on the spectrum. They're not fixed in one risk factor or another. And many people aren't going to progress all the way to dependent use or cannabis use disorder. That's not the case. So wherever you are on the spectrum, just know that it's never too early or too late to seek support and learn more about cannabis, the risks it has to our health, and learning more about how to build a healthy lifestyle. So with that said, we're going to go into some support services that you can refer to. So just as a quick question here, a true or false statement, if you use support services, specifically if you're a youth or adolescent, are your parents going to be notified? Do you think this is true or false? All right, some responses coming in already. A lot of people are choosing false, which is great. Yeah, so the majority of you say false, which is absolutely correct. So the purpose of youth services is that they have a responsibility for ensuring a person's privacy and confidentiality. The only case in which this would be overruled is if someone is communicating the intention to harm themselves or to harm others. But in all other cases, they will keep everything that is said between you and the professional and the provider for confidentiality.
Absolutely. There's that duty to report there, right? If the individual is at risk of being harmed, that the service provider does have that duty to protect the youth.
Yeah.
Now, there are free and confidential services available all across Canada. The one that we always like to communicate for a national audience, and we like to make sure that youth really see this one, is Kids Help Phone. Kids Help Phone is a free anonymous service provider available all across the country. They offer service by phone, text, online chat, or through social media. They allow access to educational resources, upcoming health and wellness programs, as well as providing information on how to actually provide support to someone, not just if they're struggling with cannabis, but if they're struggling with, say, problem gambling, if they're struggling with depression, if they're struggling with mental health issues in general. They also offer counseling supports and discussion sort of forums whereby they can speak to an individual if they're in need. One of the other interesting things about the Kids Help Phone website, if you go to kidshelpphone.ca, is they actually even have a search directory. And this is really helpful if you're in a community whereby there's a great deal of providers who may be more localized for the youth. They can name the name of their city, what sort of provider they're looking for, type that into the panel, and they'll actually find a list of nearby service providers that they can connect with. So not only is this a national resource that kids can access anywhere, but it does help them connect with the agencies in their own regions. Now, our program also offers a great deal of other resources pertaining to cannabis and to mental health. Obviously, we do like to promote our own website, which you can find the link in the chat. It is ymcagta.org/YCAP. And you'll notice when it pops up, I think it says youthcannabisawareness.ymcagta.org. But I find this is just a quicker URL to kind of grab. I also just realized I sent it directly to my co-facilitator instead of the audience. So we're going to put that in so that everyone can see it, ymcagta.org. Our website allows visitors to review educational resources created by our staff, as well as external links in our Knowledge Hub, our Digital Youth for Youth contest, and it also gives the option, if say you did like this presentation and you thought, you know what, I'd love to have this presentation for a youth group in my area, a classroom in my area, a program that I work for. You can book any of our workshops at any time. They are entirely free of charge, and we're available all across Canada. Second, we have the Cannabis Knowledge Exchange Hub created by the Center of Addiction and Mental Health. This connects service providers and stakeholders with credible and evidence-based information on the non-medical use of cannabis. If you're looking for primary documentation and resources to learn more about cannabis education, the KE Hub is a wonderful resource, especially from these last 5 years. Now, finally, if you're looking for something, say you have youth that you're working with and you want them to learn on a module whereby they can have a takeaway, a certification, so to speak. The Cannabis and Schizophrenia program created a module that we know as Cannabis and Mental Health. This was actually created by youth within their program for youth. It's a 90-minute online module, which explores a range of key issues, from understanding why people choose to use cannabis, discussing the endocannabinoid system, and discussing the impact of cannabis legalization on communities, as well as harm reduction bases and more. And if you ever want to learn more about that resource, you can access it at cannabisandmentalhealth.ca. It is a wonderful module that I cannot say enough good about. Now, the very last thing before we wrap up, I did have someone ask in the chat panel if we make the presentation slides themselves available. We will not be sending out the deck itself, but we did do a recording of this presentation today so that you can actually access the recording at any time. I'm happy to send it along, but all of the resources that we used are posted on this final slide. We looked at resources from the Alberta Family Wellness, the CCSA, Canadian Public Health, the Centre of Developing Children, the Government of Canada, various resources from the Government of Canada, as well as different sort of research articles and medical journals from the last number of years. And if you would like to learn more, or if you would like a copy of the presentation, you can also email me at any time at steve.keller@ymcagta.org. And I do have my email in the chat panel. And if you have any other questions, you are certainly more than welcome to stick around. Otherwise, we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Do you have anything you want to add there, Meg?
No, just thank you everyone for being such a great audience who brought some really great questions for us to answer. So very grateful for that. And yeah, take care, have a great day, and we will stick around in case you have any other questions you'd like to our help with.